Good morning and welcome to my presentation on manuka honey. What is manuka honey and what makes it so different to its regular counterparts? Why is it that manuka honey can fetch $1,000 per kg on the export market, whereas regular honey only fetches $12? Manuka is produced when the bees feed solely on the manuka flower, which is on the manuka tree. This produces special honey, which has mysterious non-peroxide antiseptic properties. Regular honey has antiseptic properties, but non-peroxide doesn't degrade, whereas the regular peroxide degrades with heat or light. Finally, manuka honey also has many other claimed health benefits, such as soothing a sore throat, aiding with stomach ulcers, and even treating acne. There's a really big list. Now, we're looking here at the Chinese export supply chain. So regular supply chains have the producer at the top. However, I have put the consumer at the top because I believe that this supply chain is solely influenced by the Chinese producer. Without their demand, there wouldn't even be a market for manuka honey. So they're at the top here. And the information flows down to the producer while the physical product flows up. And there are 5 parties in this supply chain. The beekeeper, the producer, they produce the raw honey, they look after the bees, they ensure that it is all done correctly. They then give the raw honey in its hives to the transportation company, who must ensure that it doesn't get damaged, and they take it to the extraction and processing facilities, which extract the honey, firstly with centrifugal force to get the honey out, and then they process it. They pasteurize, they don't, they heat it, they don't, it depends on the processing facility. It's then transported by the transportation company to the exporter. So the exporter has a close working relationship with a Chinese distributor. Without this, they wouldn't have access to the market. And the exporter is the last point between New Zealand and China. And finally, they deliver the final product through various retail outlet opportunities to the Chinese consumer. And the lines here, this is a feedback loop. The whole supply chain is ultimately a continuous feedback loop. Feedback comes from the consumer down. It influences what the producer does, and then their feedback about what works and what doesn't goes back up, and it's just continuous. The relationship is harmonious. So now we're looking at the general influences of regulation on the whole supply chain. Now, if you look at closer detail, there have been examples listed for each stage, but the main influences are the parties in New Zealand have to register with MPI, and this is to give MPI, which is the Ministry of Primary Industries, control over who is actually exporting. They can keep an eye on the parties and ensure that everyone who's registered meets the quality, the compliance that they need to. Another influence is various acts, such as the Biosecurity Act 1993 and the Food Act 1981, soon to be 2014. So these acts are, by law, the parties must comply with the things within the acts. An example of this is in the Biosecurity Act, you must register your apiaries as a beekeeper because this prevents the spread of diseases such as American foulbrood and also enables traceability. There's various other influences of regulation, but it is felt because there are processes and procedures that must be followed along the way. And finally, the Chinese consumer, a massive one there is food safety. Their domestic goods do not have the food safety that we are so lucky to enjoy. Therefore, it's a massive regulatory presence for them. They're really keen on food safety. However, I will discuss 2 of these regulatory influences in more detail, and that is MPI and the Chinese consumer behaviour and preferences. I have picked these out as the 2 most significant because even though there's laws and acts which you must legally abide by, without these 2, the market wouldn't exist. There wouldn't be demand. It just wouldn't work. And I'll explain why. For MPI, they're the regulator. They enforce all of the regulation in place and they make sure that it's abided by. On their own website, they state that one of their purposes is to protect New Zealand exports. It's to protect and maintain our reputation as a quality producer of goods, because without this reputation we have nothing. We rely on this reputation to get us our exports, which therefore gets us our income, because that's the purpose of regulation. Regulation exists because a market or a producer of a product cannot prove that their good is safe. So New Zealand can say, we produce great goods, but where's the proof? Now we say we produce great goods, and the Chinese consumer knows that the producers and exporters are all required under regulation to produce these goods. That's your proof. It's the regulation. And finally, MPI, they enforce this. They audit, they have officers who can fine you if you're not compliant, and they can even deregister you. And as you know, if you're not registered with MPI, you can't export. So by being deregistered, that completely takes you off the market, ruins your business, ruins your livelihood. So you need to comply with the regulation. Under the consumer behaviour, without consumer preferences, what would there be? Without consumer demand, why would you produce a good? And in China, the demographics shifting from a lower socioeconomic group to a slightly higher one. And while it's low compared to what we have, for them, they're open to this new world of disposable income. And studies have proven that they are continually spending more money on imported goods. And that for Chinese consumers, the third most important quality that they look for when they're buying a good is traceability. And that's what regulation does. It enables this traceability. Without their demand for our good, there would be no export markets to send to. And that is why I believe consumer preferences are such an important regulatory influence on all the parties along the supply chain. Now, there are three main issues here which impact the manuka supply chain and its regulatory environment, and I'll briefly touch on these. So the first one is fraudulent mislabelling. Due to the demand, due to the high commodity price, the gold rush has started, and people are producing honey, which is not manuka, not certified, and they are selling it as manuka. And that undercuts New Zealand, it undercuts our reputation, and it undercuts our goods, because New Zealand manuka has been sold, but it's been tested and it's not actually New Zealand manuka. So our reputation is degraded, and there goes our access to the market. Hence the tests and the official definitions. These are required by law now, and that's a result of this issue. Regulation has been put in place, which was costly and time consuming. It took 18 months to reach that definition. There's rivalry across the ditch. The Australians try to sell manuka honey as well, yet manuka is a Māori word, so you would think that it's a New Zealand moniker. Therefore, New Zealand is trying to trademark this term. In doing so, we would gain a monopoly share of the manuka market, cut Australia out of the picture, and truly capitalise on the manuka honey we produce. Once again though, it's costly. And finally, tooth poisoning. This is a major food safety issue, and it is why so much of our regulation exists, because regulation is a way to ensure that the good practices most people would abide by are abided by everyone. So that's tooth testing, ensuring that the levels are below 0.7 milligrams per kg. Now finally, some conclusions I have drawn about the regulation in the environment of the supply chain. There's disadvantages and advantages. A clear disadvantage is cost. Regulation is expensive. Everyone has to register. Everyone has to renew their registration. Everyone has to audit. There's levies. There's so many different costs, and for big players this is fine, but for the little players that can push them out of the game. There's the loss of the manuka label. So for those producers who are producing manuka prior to the official definitions that no longer meet these definitions, they can't sell under manuka. Long story short, they lose out on the money because they're just selling as regular honey now. And finally, there's potentially a reduction in exports. This is what many parties believe, because by reducing the amount of people who are official manuka producers, how can the only ones left produce the same amount? How can they meet the demand? You know, it makes no sense. But there's advantages, and these advantages are massive. And the first one is reputation protection. As I said, that is MPI's purpose, protecting our reputation as an exporter, because without it, how are we going to make our money? We need that reputation to thrive off, because New Zealand has a reputation for the high quality goods that we produce. It ensures authenticity, so the consumers are gaining value, and that's important, because if consumers gain value, they're going to want your product. So by knowing that the product they're consuming is authentic manuka, they're going to be happy and they're going to want to buy it. And finally, there's food safety. Regulation itself massively contributes to food safety. By knowing what could go wrong and preventing it, food safety is massively increased. No tooth poisoning, no random things found in your honey. It's a win-win for the producer and the consumer, because the consumer wants the good, they demand the good, and they get the good that they want. It's high quality, and the producer can capitalise. And all the parties along the supply chain in between benefit as well, because as the consumer pays money, it filters down through the supply chain. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope that you have learned a little bit more about the manuka honey supply chain, its export supply chain, and the impact of regulation. Regulation exists to prove that a product is safe, to prove that all the processes in place are enforced, and it really just links the gap between the producer and the consumer. The consumer gets what they want, and the producer gets the money. Thank you very much.